On paper, Christianity and horror films sound like a match made in hell. No pun intended. But boy, was I mistaken.
It's starting to happen. Can you feel it, James? Can you feel it?
Before anybody says anything, I know I'm several months late on this movie, but I do have a good excuse, and I've said that in several of my other reviews. And that's because I didn't have a way to watch it. Like, it was put in a select number of theaters. It wasn't a very wide release. I believe it was a wide release, which would be around 2,000 theaters. But it was not in one near me. So I had to wait for streaming and rental and all other crap. So I finally got to watch it just today. And I was definitely looking forward to this movie for obvious reasons. I look forward to anything that isn't woke shit. Unless it's not woke shit and looks like garbage, but this one actually had an intriguing idea. And again, faith-based movies are getting better nowadays. Faith-based used to be... apologize for this pun again, but they used to be hell for the movie industry because they were usually not very well received and they usually didn't do very well at the box office. But nowadays, they're getting more effort thrown into them. So they're obviously making better movies. Hell, just yesterday I talked about Sound of Freedom, which was made by a faith-based studio, whether the movie itself wasn't really faith-based, even though there were some elements there. But it was made by a religious company, and usually that would spell death for a movie at the box office. But Sound of Freedom is actually quite cleaning house, and is even cutting into Mission Impossible's box office numbers, and is even beating Indiana Jones currently. So that tells you all you need to know. This one didn't do too well at the box office because it was released in less theaters, and honestly, the Sound of Freedom had a lot more hype, or has a lot more hype building around it right now, especially since how much they're trying to... I talked about it in that review, but they're trying to cover that movie up so bad with all the shenanigans at the theaters. If you haven't seen any of that, I briefly talked about it in my review. Maybe I'll do a short on it, who knows. But I finally got around to watching this movie today, and I have to say, it was a really well done movie. I always get nervous when watching these movies because I want them to be really good. Because I want them to drive out the woke crap that studios have been putting out the last 5 years. But I'm always worried that it's just going to be yeah, it doesn't do that, like it's anti-woke, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good film. 2 films that, or I guess 3 actually, that have come out that are anti-woke, that have been very good, are Super Mario Brothers, The Covenant, and Sound of Freedom. You can maybe throw Sisu in there as well if you want, but that's up for debate. So the main premise of this is that hours before his scheduled execution, a serial killer, essentially, is put through psychiatric evaluation and determined whether or not he is eligible for the death sentence or if he should be labeled as mentally insane, which means you cannot be put the death penalty because, you know, that's obviously not fair. If you're mentally insane, that means you don't really have control over what you do. But the kicker here is that this person named something Wayne Brady, and that kind of word Wayne Brady, and that name, every time they said his full name, which was almost every time they said his name, always I had to kind of it made it hard to take the movie seriously because of, you know, Wayne Brady. He's a freaking another actor / comedian and stuff. So every time I heard Edward Wayne Brady popped in my head. So it wasn't really the movie's fault, but that's just the reality of it. But back to the movie, the kicker is that he's possessed by a demon named, well, Nefarious. And he actually wants to be executed. So basically he moves on to a new victim, and he wants James, the psychiatrist, to write his book, which would essentially be a call for people to essentially follow the devil, which is quite common nowadays, but we'll get to that. Now, unlike the other anti-woke movies that I've covered, those ones were virtually perfect in my eyes, because they were well-made movies. This one is a really good movie, but it does have some drawbacks, and I want to get to that first. First one, unfortunately, is Sean Patrick Flanery. His acting is not very good, and I know he's a good actor, so that hurts me to say, but he's trying too hard, is the problem. When he's possessed, he's constantly, like, excessively blinking like this and twitching like this, trying to convince you that he's possessed, and it's too much. All he had to do was change the voice like he did, but he was talking like this the entire movie whenever he was possessed. And then the other side, which is actually Edward, he didn't convince, like, he was supposed to be acting scared the entire time, because obviously, but it wasn't convincing either. It was over the top. It wasn't. He needed to restrain himself. He tried to do the Willem Dafoe Green Goblin thing, where oh my god, what's the word I'm looking for? He made one side look overly, like, scared to make the other side look more threatening. And that never works. It doesn't work because it just comes across as hokey acting. The rest of the acting is pretty decent, and again, Sean Patrick Flanery isn't bad, but again, he needed to rein in his performance a bit. Some of the other things is, like, the ending scene, the interview sequence. It's a good sequence, and I like the conversation that it has. I like the whole scene, but it goes on a bit too long. So that's not really a knock, it's just something I noticed. And the ending is kind of corny. I didn't really like how they ended the movie. And one thing I do wish this movie had done, which isn't really a knock against it, it's just what I would have preferred, is had they made this movie more ambiguous. They flat out say and show that he was indeed possessed by a demon. He even possesses James for a time and possesses somebody at the end of the movie. I wish they had gone for, well, a more faith-based route, instead of it being, oh yeah, it's actually a demon from hell. I wish they had made it a bit more ambiguous, where it's just the doctor eventually chooses to believe him or not to believe him, where we go to the end of the movie, and we're left to wonder, was he really possessed by a demon, or was he crazy? It's stuff for the audiences to talk about. This movie reminded me a lot of The Dark Knight, where it had a lot of long conversations, but this movie made a bit more sense because it wasn't an action movie. But it does have that thing where a lot of the conversations should be done by the audiences and not the movie, but I like how the movie did it. And something else, this gave me a lot of vibes of 12 Angry Men, because the majority of this movie takes place in this one enclosed space to up the intensity a little bit, and I did like that. I was worried this movie was going to drag 10 loads of ass because it's all in one room and it's just a bunch of conversations happening, but the dialogue was really well written and most of the acting carried through. Even though Flanery's performance was a bit over the top, he was still fun to watch. And he was convincing with his lines. It's just with the facial expressions. He needed to stop doing this every time he was possessed. He needed to stop doing that. That was really distracting. But again, I really like the dialogue in this movie. I like the conversations they have. It's all well done. There are a couple times, like, this is obviously trying to fight against woke culture, and I'm all for that. But there are some times where it's a bit too on the nose. I talk about how woke movies are always way too on the nose. This one started to creep into that territory a little bit. Like, the demon, Nefarious, straight up admits that they're using their demonic powers through, like, their movies, television, media to influence people. And that's a clever idea, and it's actually true. But again, it was way too on the nose. And there are other times like that. Like, I do like the scene where he basically straight up talks about, where it's an abortion talk because the psychiatrist's girlfriend's having an abortion and Nefarious knows about that. And he describes what happens when you kill one, how you kind of like rip the baby limb from limb inside the womb, and then essentially you're essentially giving it to hell. And again, that one was a lot more, that one needed to be a bit more on the nose because, again, it's happening right at that moment in time in the movie, and that's something that needs to be made explicitly clear because people apparently have no fucking idea about that, even though I do, because I'm versed in science, and actually chemistry and biology stuff I'm actually pretty good at, so I already knew that. But apparently people who support abortion do not understand exactly how it happens. And again, these are the same people that won't eat eggs because it's killing baby chickens, even though they're not baby chickens unless they're like actually fertilized. But they're totally fine with killing a human baby inside the womb because it's just a clump of cells. This is the kind of logic this movie wants to fight against, and that's one of the reasons why I like this movie, is because it goes based on logic. There isn't any time of the movie, like, contradicting itself, or having some kind of plot hole that doesn't make a ton of sense. It has some silly moments, like I said, Flannery's acting's a bit over the top, the ending was kind of corny, but I really enjoyed this movie. Again, movies like this, there aren't too much to talk about. Like, I can rant about fucking Little Mermaid, or The Flash, or Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey as much as I want, but movies like these are just solid, well-made movies, and that's all I ask out of Hollywood. Does it have a political agenda? Yeah, obviously. But the difference is that this movie it's supporting faith. That's the difference. The other ones, they're trying to indoctrinate kids. This one, it's trying to protect them. They're trying to protect people from doing all the demonic things that Hollywood supports nowadays. Same thing with Sound of Freedom, where it was fighting against child sex trafficking, which, again, should not be a political debate. Shouldn't be a debate at all, actually. But it should never be a political debate. This one pretty much just destroys the left's viewpoints, and I find that really funny because it does it in only an hour and a half. This movie wasn't overly long, and the pacing was actually pretty good, and that's another thing I'm always nervous about with these movies. I wonder if the pacing is going to be really bad, but it wasn't. This movie handled its story very well. So, that's all I got for Nefarious. It does have a few flaws, but overall, I still really enjoyed it. I'm going to give Nefarious an A-. Yeah, that seems fair. Thank you all so much for watching, and yes, next review will be Indiana Jones, I promise. Unfortunately.